This afternoon, we will have Dr. Neal Pollock presenting for us. His research interests focus on human health and safety in extreme conditions, and one of those that he's going to share with us this afternoon is breath holding, physiology, hazards, and community education. So now we'll welcome him to the podium.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And thanks to Kim Burgess, who got all of this started when she invited me to present at their NDPA meeting earlier on this year, which led to this cascade of presentations. Breath hold is an interesting topic. People talk about the why we do this. There are accidents that involve breath hold, absolutely. But if you focus only on the accidents, you miss an awful lot of opportunity. Just before we get started, disclosures. I am going to talk about some commercial equipment. I have no financial interest in the primarily one company that I'm going to mention. And I do get salary from Duke University and Divers Alert Network, so I am conflicted, if you will, with that affiliation. Okay, breath hold activity. Breath hold is used for a lot of things. Recreationally, you can think of play, personal competition, exploration. People use it. Then we've got the competitive events. You can see the list there. Underwater hockey, underwater rugby. Underwater hockey, I don't know if you know, you play with a 10-inch wooden stick and a stainless steel puck. You push it along the bottom to a goal, works beautifully. Underwater rugby, you have something about the size of a basketball filled with salt water. So it's slightly more dense in a freshwater swimming pool. And you have to push that into a goal, into a net, like a garbage can. It's very high tech. Those are both great breath hold events. Synchronized swimming. If you remember the opening session today, there was some beautiful footage of underwater synchronized swimming. And then finally, spearfishing and freediving. Lots of different activities. And the thing I want to start with is the idea that breath hold is not evil. There are a lot of people who do a lot of breath hold diving very safely. The trick is how to identify the risks and minimize them, not necessarily, in my opinion, it shouldn't be to shut down the idea of breath hold. So, we're going to talk about these things. I'm going to give you a picture of the physiology of breath hold. We're going to talk a little bit about the aquatic setting as it works in the pool, but then I'm also going to shift it to open water. Because to me, breath hold or any activity in a pool is a gateway to get out to the wider world. And so it doesn't end in the pool. So I want you to be aware of some of the safety procedures that aren't necessary in the pool, but they can work very well in a wide range of open water environments. Okay, first off, to let you know, and my apologies if you can't see this clearly, the lights have to be bright so they can film this. Apparently what you will see online, you actually get better resolution on the slides. What we have here are the competitive categories of breath hold competition that are recognized by the AIDA, the Association for the Development of Apnea. And there are 8 competitive categories, and the comprehensive list will be on that on the CD you have in your package. So if you're interested, you can look at them. But let me give you the broad strokes. You start with static breath hold, which is just laying face down in a pool. Now, you're not laying alone. You've always got somebody with you, and you've got a tap response system. They tap you every 15 seconds, and you have to raise a finger, give an okay, to show that you are in good form. And there it goes. Then you've got other events. Dynamic is where you're swimming horizontally in a pool. Then you've got different elements where you're diving vertically, the most extreme of which is what's called no limits. In that case, you're riding down on a weighted sled, and you rise up on a balloon, on a lift bag. Now, just to see what your perspective is, what do you suppose the record static breath hold is? How long can you hold your breath? One breath, no augmentation with oxygen, just one breath. I've got one vote for 4 minutes. 18 minutes. Kim, wow. Whew. Okay, Kim is going to demonstrate an 18-minute breath hold, starting now. Actually, okay, so we've got somewhere between 4 and 18. That's a pretty safe bet. What about maximum depth for breath hold? What do you think? What's the maximum depth that has been achieved on a no-limits breath hold? 120 feet, 600 feet, another broad range. And this is good because it shows this field has evolved a lot in the last 20 years. What a lot of people grew up with as breath hold or snorkeling is a completely different reality. So let me tell you what the record is for an air breath hold. It's 11 minutes and 35 seconds. If it's augmented by oxygen, it's 22 minutes and 30 seconds. For maximum depth on breath hold, and this is going down and coming back up and being conscious when you hit the surface, 702 feet. So these are the numbers, and I appreciate that some of you in the back may not be able to see them, but again, static breath hold, 1135 for males. Females, 902. That's huge. That's just a huge time underwater. And the no limits, which is the most extreme, that's where you're riding down on the sled and riding up on a balloon, 702 feet for males, 525 for women. Awesome depths. Now, the thing I want you to appreciate in terms of the challenge, when you get down to the maximum depth of your dive and you decide it's time to turn around, you're only halfway done. Because it takes about the same time to go up that it took to go down. And so this is a really challenging endeavor. But people have achieved it safely. Okay. The International Life-Saving Federation in 2011 developed a position statement concerning shallow water blackout, what they called shallow water blackout. And that is actually one of the core problems we have right now, the ambiguity of the terminology. And their first point, and these are paraphrased, but the first point I have up here is the most critical, and that is that blackout is caused by excessive hyperventilation. That's an important thing that I'd like everybody to leave the room realizing. We breath hold every respiratory cycle. At the end of every respiratory cycle is a breath hold. There is nothing foreign to us about breath hold. You have safety factors built in that keep you conscious. Doesn't matter whether you're awake or asleep. We tend to do pretty well breathing. And so breath hold is not the hazard. The hazard is excessive hyperventilation. And I'm going to show you exactly what happens there, but the problem is the excessive hyperventilation. So what you want to do is you want to find where is the safe point between no hyperventilation and the point where it can cause you problem. Because I'll tell you right now, anybody who is otherwise healthy, I don't care how hard you try to hold your breath, you're not going to pass out. You're not going to have a problem because you have all kinds of intrinsic controls that regulate and will force you to end that breath hold. So it's just not a problem. If a kid takes one breath and goes underwater, he or she will come up when they have to, assuming they can swim. There are always caveats. But the problem is the excessive hyperventilation. There's another bit of a challenge in some of the discussion, and that is some of the other factors for the unexplained death. One of the problems we have in reviewing breath hold incidents is that there's very little physical evidence. There's no evidence for post-mortem analysis. So what you end up relying on are witness statements and situational factors because you haven't got the forensic evidence to point a finger at the problem. And that's led to a lot of different discussion. You'll hear people talking about a very fit diver or swimmer who might have suffered from prolonged QT and they went into cardiac arrest because of that. It's not impossible, but it's highly improbable that somebody could have a very active, fit, engaging life, and then suddenly that QT is what dropped them. That's like looking for the zebra instead of looking for the horse. And the horse is probably excessive hyperventilation. So that really is the problem in most cases. And some of the other ambiguous things, when you talk about diving response or cold shock response, sure, somebody drops into very cold water. If they're medically compromised, they can go into cardiac arrest. That is possible. If it's not cold water, that's highly likely that it's going to happen. The final point they make is one of the best, and that is that prevention is better than the cure. And that's really what we're here to talk about today. How do we prevent this? The outstanding issue is confusing terminology. And I hope that at the end of the presentation, it's going to make sense to you. There's a real problem from what I can see in the aquatic community now, and that is that any time somebody's in a pool and they're unconscious, the term shallow water blackout is pulled out. And that's actually, in almost all cases in shallow pools we have today, probably not what happened. And so we'll talk about the origins of the term shallow water blackout when we get there. Okay, a little bit of background for us. We've maintained a diving incident database on compressed gas fatalities since 1987. We started collecting breath hold incidents as a dedicated effort in 2004 because we were seeing more and more breath hold activity and we were seeing cases, so we knew it was time to get a dedicated effort. So since 2004, we've captured approximately 40 fatalities a year that have involved people with a mask and typically fin or fins. So we're not looking at swimmers. We're looking at people who have some kind of equipment that you would normally associate with snorkeling or free diving. Now that 40 a year, we're probably not capturing all of them. Now that is an international capture that we can get primarily through individual reports or from passive keyword searches on the internet. When pages appear that have keywords that we flag, we are notified. About half of those are captured in the U.S. So we're capturing about 20 fatalities a year that involve people with mask and usually fins dying. So that gives you a little bit on the numbers. The top concerns that we identify are listed here. And most important is hyperventilation-induced blackout. Again, no forensic evidence, but when we look at witness statements, we look at the situation, if we could control the loss of life from hyperventilation-induced blackout, we would probably reduce our fatalities by at least 50%, if not more like 75%. And so this is an important issue. But again, this isn't breath hold that I'm saying is the risk. I'm saying excessive hyperventilation. And there's a huge difference there. Then we have inadequate support. Inadequate support is another factor that should speak very loudly to the aquatic community. If you have people who are actively monitoring a diver when he or she is doing a breath hold, they can do it very, very safely. I'll show you a clip that will demonstrate how easy it can be in some situations. When a community gets used to dealing with breath hold activity, it becomes very straightforward to manage these cases. Because if you manage them quickly, they are not a problem. Medical health is a problem, and I'm not now talking about the prolonged QT that I mentioned earlier. I'm not talking about the exotic conditions. If you look at our incident database, our youngest victim was 5 years old, the oldest right now in his 90s. And what we tend to see is that with increasing age, it's more likely that there will be a medical issue involved. Question? Prolonged QT, if you look at the electrical rhythm of your heart action, QT is part of the electrical pattern. And if you have a prolonged QT, it's associated with a risk of cardiac problem. And so this is something, it's again, one of those things that's fairly exotic. It's been pointed at, and you'll see people writing about it, and it can happen, but it's relatively rare. It's much more likely that somebody is going to be hyperventilating to excess, and they will black out because of that. But because you've got no good forensic evidence for either, you get some people who say, wow, it might be this. It's exciting to talk about, but it's a little bit misleading because we've got an elephant in the corner, which is the excessive hyperventilation, and that's probably what we should focus on rather than the exotic medical issues. Most of the medical issues that we can identify are probably associated with normal aging. There are cardiac risk factors when you age. And look at it this way. You get a lot of people who may go to the Great Barrier Reef. They're not divers. They're told the reef is beautiful. They want to experience it. So they decide, well, let's go snorkeling. They've never snorkeled in their life. They may not even be swimmers, but they go into the water. A lot of people don't realize that just immersion in water causes a pretty significant volume of blood to be returned to your chest because of the hydrostatic pressure on your legs. And that sudden bolus of blood puts a strain. If you have a weak heart and you have that strain of immersion and then the strain of breathing on a snorkel, which gives you higher breathing resistance, then you're fighting a little bit of wave or current, you're a little bit anxious because of what you're doing, you can very easily see someone having problems. And so that's the kind of thing we are more likely to see. That's one example of what we would expect to see as a medical compromise. Now the last three items here, entanglement, animal interaction, and boat interaction, those are probably overrepresented. And the reason for that is quite simple. They have physical evidence. When somebody is taken by a shark, you can bet it's going to be reported on the news and on the net, and so we're going to hear about those cases. When a boat propeller hits someone, same thing. There's physical evidence, and it gets reported, so we probably hear about those cases in disproportionate numbers. And so I'm not discounting them. Those are critical, and you have to think about them for diving safety, particularly in open water, but they're not probably as common as, again, that top number one, excessive hyperventilation. Let me give you a case report. And this one, I'll read it to you just because I'm not sure you can all see it in the back. A 14-year-old male was spearfishing with 2 friends off a boat anchored in 65 feet of seawater. He was observed to develop difficulties while nearing the surface on his ascent and began to sink back down in the water. He did not release his weight belt. His companions dived into the water but were unable to reach him. A scuba diver later recovered the victim's body from 65 feet. So let's just picture this. And this is classic. This is what we expect to see. You've got a kid or person who's happily swimming along. On their way up, all of a sudden they slow down, stop moving, and if they're negatively buoyant, they will start to sink. That is shallow water blackout. And I'm going to explain to you exactly why that happens in a few minutes, but that's the true presentation of what we know of in North America as shallow water blackout. And that's the one that's scary, because you've got someone who's in great shape who suddenly, without any warning, is unconscious. So what is this? Hypoxia of ascent. And I use hypoxia of ascent instead of shallow water blackout because shallow water blackout is actually a very confounded term. This probably goes beyond the interest of most people here, but that term, shallow water blackout, was first used by the British to describe the loss of consciousness in closed-circuit oxygen rebreather divers during military training. And what it was is that the gas was bypassing a scrubber that scrubbed out the CO2, and so they were actually suffering from intoxication from too much CO2, and that was why they passed out. So it's very confusing for us to then use that term to describe something that has nothing to do with excess CO2. And so that's one reason why we use hypoxia of ascent. The second reason is that in North America lately, anytime there's anybody unconscious, particularly a kid in the pool, you see it identified as shallow water blackout. And let me tell you, you can't get shallow water blackout in 6 feet of water. It just doesn't happen. So, and I'll show you the picture of it momentarily. Now, other factors we had here, overweighting. You're going to hear me recommend later that being weighted so you're neutrally buoyant at some depth underwater is important. Because when you're having a problem, it takes at least a few seconds for someone to identify it. If they're not ready to dive down and rescue you, you could sink below the point that they could easily get you. That would be bad. So if you're weighted so you're neutrally buoyant, if you're on your way up and you pass out, even if you pass up, your momentum will take you to the surface, and then you're positively buoyant, so it's a matter of rescuing you from at or very near the surface rather than having to dive down for you. In a pool, it's not so critical. In open water, it becomes very critical. So proper weighting is important. And then finally, inadequate support. I got a lot of flack the first time we released our data, and the community was saying, what do you mean? That's not inadequate support. He had a buddy. Well, if the buddy is not capable of rescuing you, it's inadequate support. I don't care that somebody's there. If you're this more skilled diver, you're diving with somebody with less skill and he or she can't help you, it's inadequate support. Okay, so that's a case. Now let's talk generically about managing risks. You've got 4 options if you want to manage risk. Number 1, you can ignore it. Never a good idea because it will eventually bite you. So that's number 1. Number 2, you can prohibit. And this is what a lot of people think is a good solution. The problem with prohibitions is it requires either voluntary compliance or policing. And that's tough. So prohibitions, they may make you feel better when you put them in place, but they're not always that easy to really ensure. The other problem with prohibitions is that if you prohibit things, you tend to stop talking about them, and you just assume everybody will follow the orders. What happens then is you have people who may not get oriented to the risks, the hazards, what could be a little safer, what is less safe, and they can get in more trouble because they weren't educated, because they were told nothing about the hazard, because the people in charge said, oh, they'll never have to worry about it, it's prohibited. And that doesn't work well, especially when you bring kids into the mix. You tell a kid something is prohibited, what is he going to do? He is going to do exactly what you said he couldn't do if he can get away with it. And that's the reality of prohibitions. Number 3, you can engineer out solutions. And if you're using tools, you can improve the safety through engineering. It's tough with breath hold because you can do it with nothing. There's a little bit of room for engineering, and so I will talk about one product that is trying to do that. But this is a very low-tech issue, so engineering out the problem into non-existence won't happen. And then finally, you've got education. And I'm a firm believer that education gives you the greatest flexibility. The challenge in operating any kind of safety program is that if you're effective, there's no evidence. If you're effective, nobody gets hurt, nobody dies. And you don't know if that's because of your efforts or because they got lucky or you got lucky. That's just one of the challenges you have to live with in safety programming. I don't think that's a bad challenge. I would much rather have somebody say, wow, you've got an easy job, you're not doing anything, than the alternative. But education really can cover for a lifetime of activity. If you prohibit something, they may even say, okay, I won't do that, that's clearly unsafe. But somewhere down the road, when they're off with their friends, and their friends say, hey, let's do this. Well, I've been doing this forever. They may go in and try it without having the background that can help make them safe. That's a problem. So now let's bring this managing risk straight down to the breath hold. Can we ignore blackout in breath hold divers? Absolutely not. This problem was really well described by Al Craig in 1961. He did a nice summary looking at primarily very well-trained swimmers and showed how they were dying. And so clearly this is a problem that has been going on for a long time. This is not a new problem. It's also one you can't justify ignoring because it's real. Well, can you prohibit it? You could, but I believe it will not be effective and it will not be productive because I really think that you're going to have people going behind their backs. And I'll tell you right now, I get emails probably no more than one every 6 weeks or 8 weeks, but it's people who say, the pool I've always trained at is now prohibiting breath hold. Is there anything you could do to help me? Here's what I do to get around it. I do my freestyle, I turn my head as though I'm breathing, but I don't take a breath. And so they're faking breathing so they can do what they want to do for their apnea training. Well, which do you think is more dangerous? Having a lifeguard that is completely oblivious to someone who's doing this, or having a lifeguard that is watching and is aware that there is a potential problem? For me, I would much rather have everybody being aware. And so that's my real problem with prohibition. Engineering, again, some equipment can do it, and you can change some procedures to make it safe, and we'll talk about those. Finally, education again. It's a great defense in terms of breath hold because when people are doing breath hold diving or training or activity of any sort, they are on the fly. They're often out there making the decisions in real time. If they understand the hazards, they can make better decisions. If they don't understand the hazards, it's a crapshoot as to what will come out of it. Now let's talk about hyperventilation and how it works to cause problems. So what we have to do, we're going to talk first about what happens during a normal breath hold without hyperventilation, and then what happens when you add hyperventilation. And so this figure, I hope you can see, we've got the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood in blue, and in yellow we've got the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood. The numbers don't have to concern you if you're not interested, but this is not drawn to scale. It's drawn to make it informative. The numbers are pretty close to accurate, but this is not drawn with precision. It's drawn to show the relationships. As I think you'll all understand, when you hold your breath, the amount of oxygen in your bloodstream is going to fall because you're consuming it. So that's metabolic consumption. So the longer you hold your breath, the more the oxygen falls. Great. The longer you hold your breath, the more the CO2 rises. No problem there. So that part is all easy. Now there are two reference lines you have to appreciate. The first is the level of CO2 that triggers an urge to breathe, because it's carbon dioxide that is our primary trigger to breathe. And so as CO2 accumulates to a given level, which is normally about 45 or 46 millimeters of mercury, you get an urge to breathe. If you're really trying to hold your breath hard, you can maybe go out to 55. And nobody can go much further than that. And if you go out to 66, which is possible, and we certainly have done that in research trials, you have a headache, and it encourages you not to do it too many times. But you break that breath hold. We have yet to have anybody who doesn't break a breath hold if they've got normal CO2 levels, because that urge to breathe just becomes overwhelming. So this urge to breathe line is critical because as that CO2 crosses that line, it triggers a breath. The last reference line that's critical for you to know is the minimum level of oxygen required to maintain consciousness. And that is right over here. Now the importance of this, if this is starting to get too messy for you, is the time difference between when the CO2 crosses the urge to breathe line and when the O2 crosses the not enough to stay conscious line. This all represents safety buffer. Are you with me there? Does that make sense? So that's the buffer. When we have an urge to breathe, we've still got lots of oxygen to keep us conscious. If we fight hard and go an extra 30 seconds even, we still have a buffer to keep us conscious. So normally, you've got a huge buffer, which is why I am willing to stake anything on the fact that a normal, healthy person cannot voluntarily hold their breath long enough to pass out. We just have way too many built-in safety factors. Now enter hyperventilation. When you hyperventilate, you're blowing off CO2. The reason you're blowing off CO2 is that we use carbon dioxide in our bloodstream to buffer the pH, the acid level of our blood. And so we concentrate 150 to 160 times the amount of CO2 in the air in our blood. That's why hyperventilation works the way it does, because we actively maintain huge reserves of CO2 in our body. So when you hyperventilate, and hyperventilation by definition is just breathing in excess of metabolic need, when you breathe in excess of metabolic need, you progressively drop the CO2 of your blood. And then when you hold your breath, it follows the same curve, but from a lower starting point. And so what we're doing, you normally, after you've taken a breath, your blood PCO2 drops to about 40 millimeters of mercury. With hyperventilation, if you hyperventilate aggressively to the point that your fingernails get tingly or your fingers get tingly, you're at about 20 millimeters of mercury. It's really amazingly reliable. You can change the pace at which people hyperventilate or the pattern, and when they get down to about 20 torr, which is another name for millimeters of mercury, you start to get that tingling. And so that's why this is drawn to show that's about the low end. Well, when this person starts to hold that breath, you'll now see that it takes a lot longer for that CO2 to cross the urge to breathe line. And most importantly, notice how those two lines are crossing at about the same point in time. That's the hazard of excessive hyperventilation. You're removing any urge to breathe because you don't reach the point, or you're right at that point where you get an urge to breathe, at the same point where you pass out because of hypoxia, not enough oxygen. Now, some people are misinformed in the community, and they think they hyperventilate to bolster their oxygen stores. You do increase your oxygen stores, but to a trivial degree. And so I have that drawn in as essentially a matching line. You do very little to boost your oxygen stores. So it's all about the carbon dioxide. When you blow it off, it takes longer to reach the level that it gives you that urge to breathe, and then it's really dicey as to whether or not you'll have that urge before you lose consciousness. So our goal is to make sure that if people hyperventilate, they don't do so much that they remove that safety factor. Now, everything I've talked about so far pertains to hyperventilation at one level in the pool, at the surface. But of course, life gets complicated because people tend to dive vertically, both in the pool and, more importantly, in open water. You now know that the deepest breath hold dive is to 702 feet. Of the 8 competitive events, more than half of them are approaching or past 300 feet. And so it's no longer unusual for people to free dive down to 300 feet. And so that's a big vertical excursion, and that has more implications for physiology. To make it clear, I have to give you just a little bit of background. How many people here are divers? Okay, for the divers, it'll probably be very familiar. For the non-divers, perhaps not. Each 33 feet of seawater provides the same pressure as the entire atmospheric column exerts at sea level. And so we have 1 atmosphere pressure at sea level. If we go down 33 feet, we're at 2 atmospheres. If we go down 66 feet, we're at 3 atmospheres. And so we've got lots of pressure change. And what happens with that pressure change is that gas in the lung is compressed. And so if our lung volume is, call it 1 liter, and it's not. You can use whatever units you want. Whatever volume is in your lungs at 1 atmosphere, when you get to 33 feet, it's half of that. When you get to 66 feet, because it's 3 atmospheres pressure, it's a third. So that pressure has influence, and this is how it influences. These are the same lines I had for the breath hold that's involving hyperventilation. And this is what happens to your oxygen during that breath hold. During the first part of the dive, as you're going down, the levels are actually stable or rising because of the increase in ambient pressure. So it's actually making it easier for you. The problem comes when you surface. When you surface, not only are you consuming it metabolically, but you're getting a fall in ambient pressure, so your PO2 drops like a stone. And so for the people who say, oh, I will be aware of the problem, they're not, because it's dropping like a stone. CO2 also doesn't help you because it rises during the dive portion, but then on the way up, it actually levels off or even decreases a little bit, so you feel really good. So that diver who's approaching the surface feels pretty comfortable. And that still, they may not have enough oxygen. They can pass out, and they can have a problem. And so vertical excursions are even more of a concern. So let's summarize this. If you're going to hyperventilate to pass out at depth, you have to hyperventilate an incredible amount because the pressure is concentrating the CO2 you have in your blood and the oxygen in your blood. So we'd call that apneic hypoxia or hypoxic blackout. If you dive to depth and then on the way up you pass out, that's much more common. That doesn't take as much hyperventilation, and we call that hypoxia of ascent. That's the high-risk portion. The major concern we have in the free diving community is that people know that hyperventilation to excess can be hazardous, and instead of acknowledging that, they've changed the name. So they say, no, I don't hyperventilate. They say, well, what do you do before you dive? Well, I do these deep series of relaxing, cleansing breaths. In other words, they hyperventilate, they just don't call it that. And that's a problem, not for the person who's experienced, but when they're educating the new person, that new person may never know the risk of hyperventilation. And so that's a concern in the free diving community. And now the big thing that everybody should want to know, how much hyperventilation is too much? Well, all the evidence we have suggests that if you hyperventilate to no more than 2 or 3 full ventilatory exchanges, it will not remove your urge to breathe to the point to get you in trouble. So modest hyperventilation, anywhere up to 2 or 3 full ventilatory exchanges, is probably perfectly safe. And I do have to tell you, in the CD, there was an error. And this one is the worst error there could be. It says 3 to 4 rather than 2 to 3. And 2 to 3, once you get up to 4, you're probably getting close to where you might have a hazard. The Navy standard used to be 3 to 4 was the max. And now the shift is 2 to 3, and that's probably far more reasonable. So my apologies, but if you look in the CD, you might want to make note for that correction. What else do divers do? And I don't want to belabor this, but if you're a lifeguard in the pool or you have lifeguards, it's worth mentioning. One of the other things breath hold divers do is they often lung pack. They'll take in a full breath, and then they'll try to get a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. And I'll show you a demo right away. And that can increase their breath hold time. It's worth noting it. When you see somebody who's lung packing, they are going to be free diving, so it's good to open up a dialogue with them. The other thing that can happen is empty lung diving. And this is one that if you ban breath hold, you'll probably have more empty lung activity, and you'll never know. Because for an empty lung dive, all you do is you exhale everything, and then you close your mouth. Well, you actually try to squeak out a little bit more. Then you close your mouth and dive down. So they're not doing that hyperventilating at all. All they're doing is blowing out all their air and then holding their breath. And since that's so counterintuitive, a lifeguard could easily miss that. You may ask why people do that. By doing that, you can get the physiological stress of a very deep dive in very shallow water. And so it's quite powerful. Now let me show you a demonstration. And so this is a woman who is doing her lung packing prior to doing a competition breath hold. This was actually in Cayman. She was trying to beat a world record. So she's doing a little bit of lung packing, full lung, and then trying to get down a little bit more. And it's all very prescribed. And she's now underwater. And there is so much experience that has come out of the competitive freediving world. They have an entire language to explain different degrees of impairment. And now, as safety people, you may say, oh, we don't want any of that. But really, there are very few accidents in the training world. So it's worth learning what they tell us. Mooglies are number one. You can have people who are perfectly conscious when they come up, but the first level of impairment is in the production of language. And it was called Mooglies because the first person who was asked after his dive what kind of coffee he wanted, he tried to say mocha java latte, and it came out Moogly. And so these were called Mooglies. The next thing you have is a samba, which is a loss of motor control. The person can be confused, their short-term memory can be impaired, they may or may not be able to protect their airway, so they need help. And then you've got frank blackout. Now, as I mentioned before, there are very few serious incidents in competition because there are so many controls. And now let's go back to that same competitor, and let's see how she does. So this is the end of her dive. Look how she's starting to flake out. Immediately, the rescue swimmer next to her, his prime job, his only job, is to protect her airway. Now watch her face. She gives an okay. She's still a little off. Now her breathing is normalized. And if you can see the look on her face, you'll see chagrin right here because she realized, damn it, I just blacked out. And that was loss of motor control. It wasn't a complete blackout, but they're that easy. In 10 seconds, they come back to themselves. And you'll see that's how it works in the competition. And it's such a normal event, not in competition, but in training, they explore the edges. And then in competition, they're usually more conservative, so they're not disqualified. But again, a lot has been learned from these activities. So how do we optimize the risk management? Well, think about it. Risk management, risk tolerance is always personal. You've got acceptable risk that goes up if you perceive a good benefit. And it goes down if you perceive that there's a high severity of the outcome. I would posit that if you don't educate people about the severity of the outcomes, they will favor pushing the risk. Because too much hyperventilation, I mean, when you hyperventilate, it truly works. But if you push it too far, it is unsafe. But you definitely want to educate people. Because we suffer from the optimism bias. If you ask anybody, everybody else's family is in a little bit better shape than their family. Their kid is just a little faster, a little stronger, a little whatever. That's the optimism bias. We tend to favor ourselves. What we want to do is shift the language to accentuate positive reinforcement. Rather than having a kid go out there, try hyperventilation, find it successful, and say, look, all those warnings were nonsense. I don't have to listen to them. That's bad. What you want to do instead is you say, if you're careful in how you implement this, you won't have a problem. Then when they come back with no problem, they'll say, wow, I'm glad I did that. I didn't worry, and I had no problem. So you need to change the message from being one of prohibition to thoughtful utility. That way you can reinforce the right kind of behavior. So what are our protocols? And I'll go quickly through these because these are primarily, we've talked about them, but they're a summary for your benefit. Number one, limit and control the hyperventilation. No more than 1 to 3 full ventilatory exchanges, and you're probably in very good shape. Defensive weighting, we've talked about it. Minimum depth, you want it to be neutrally buoyant at the bottom of a pool. And if it's for deeper diving, deeper than that. Direct supervision. You don't do this alone. If you've got somebody with you who is looking at you throughout the entire breath hold dive and through the first 30 seconds post-dive, if you have a problem, they will capture it. Make sure there's adequate recovery time. You try to stay on the surface twice as long as your breath hold time. And then automatic surfacing devices. For those people who like to say Spearfish alone, there's a neat vest that has come out that you set it, and if you violate your time underwater or your depth, it automatically fires off and takes you to the surface. And I'm happy to talk to anybody about that offline. So, safety protocols. What do we have when we move to open water? We can use a buddy system that you're probably familiar with in the pool, but you've also got something called close support surfacing. This is a profile of a typical deep dive. This is a dive to 200 feet. You can see that the time going down is about the same as the time going up. So you know when this diver is hitting the bottom. If when that diver hits the bottom and turns around, a safety diver starts swimming down, they meet at the middle, come up together, and you know exactly that that diver is in good form. That's close support surfacing. You've also got this kind of system, which is a surface float that has float with a line that runs down to a big disc. Each diver is attached to that line by a 2-meter tether. You've got 60 pounds of weight right there that are held in place by a double brake system. When you release that brake, boom, the surface, that disc goes up to the surface, dragging the diver with it. And so with no muss, no delay, you can bring a diver to the surface. We deploy that system in 500 feet of water, and with a small group can safely train, or people can compete. Okay, final ones. If you're in the open water, and again, transiting from the pool to the ocean, If you're going to spearfish, try not to carry it on your body. Make sure you have adequate surface markings so you're not a target for boats. Dive location to avoid boat traffic. And then try not to mix free diving with compressed gas diving because there are some risks. And then finally, good training is important. If you have cases or you know people who've had problems, we have an incident report that we would like people to fill out. We're trying to get more information from survived events because that way we can pass it on to other people. So, in summary, breath hold is not the safety hazard. Excessive hyperventilation is the hazard. And the risks are best managed through education. If we improve the culture of safety, we do well. And if you do have an incident, the priority is airway management. And then finally, the terminology I've talked about today. Breath hold, it's part of every respiratory cycle. Hyperventilation is ventilation in excess of metabolic need. And apneic hypoxia takes a lot of hyperventilation for you to pass out at the bottom. For you to pass out at the bottom of a pool takes a lot of work. And then finally, hypoxia of ascent is what you get when you use excessive hyperventilation. Thank you very much.